Welcome to Just Blazor program. Today we have another one of my Blazor versus videos. Today we have Blazor versus Angular, and they're gonna fight in my little. Not really. Unfortunately, I don't have the budget for that, as you have seen from my last video. Not much of a budget here. So, anyways, what are we gonna discuss today? We're gonna discuss the differences between Blazor and Angular. But since Angular is the contender in this video, we're going to go over a little bit of Angular's history, and then we're going to go over some technical stuff about Angular, some nuances that it might have, and then compare it to Blazor ultimately, and see whether or not you might want to make the switch. I know I won't, but that's my bias. So give me a second while I run an ad or my intro. Well, before we get started into the technical stuff like talking about performance, because I know everyone asks, what's Blazor? It's Blazor better than Angular? Is this faster than it? Blah blah. I know, I get it. I know it's what you want, but we're waiting until you get that lollipop at the end. All right. In this case, we're just gonna talk about the Angular history really quick. So when I talk about Angular, or when Angular is discussed in the internet and the forums and whatnot, what we're discussing is something called Angular 2, actually, because there's another Angular called Angular JS. Now, we don't want anything to do with that because that's the older one, and Angular is supposed to be replacing it. A lot of people still use it. That's why there's a lot of forums out there, and a lot of people have been using it because Angular is so old. Angular JS was was created before May 2011. May 2011 is when Angular came out, and JS was older than that. So that means that Angular is probably the oldest modern web framework that we know of. You could say Razor might be a little bit older, whatever. You could say that the preceding .NET, other .NET frameworks were older than that, and they had their own version of components and stuff like that. We're not talking about that because there's a reason why those things are kind of sucky. So when I talk about a modern web framework, I am talking about Angular, React, Blazor, Vue.js. Let's get rusty, whatever, all that stuff. So the reason why I differentiate that is because they each have a very similar way of doing things. There's a component-based web framework that allows it to do stuff on the browser, either by directly touching it or by indirectly touching it. And it allows you, the developer, to develop easier than if you would have to actually touch the underlying language of all of it. So in this case, Angular is supposed to allow you to essentially translate everything into JavaScript so that you don't have to actually write plain JavaScript, which is the whole point of Angular JS in the first place, is to make JavaScript easier. Angular came out later because Angular JS was kind of redundant in a weird way, because JavaScript was already trying to make itself a little bit easier to develop with. So Angular JS was a little bit not as useful at that point. So then it was modernized into what we know as Angular 2, which has been just given the name of Angular. So when I'm talking about Angular, I'm talking about this Angular, the modern one, Angular blah blah blah, the one they keep on giving versions to, and not Angular JS. So don't get confused, okay? When people talk about Angular JS, they will say the JS at the end. Anyways, Angular is owned by Google. So if you don't know who owns Google, I mean, not who owns Google, you know who created Angular and who basically is in charge of it, is going to be someone at Google, just like how Microsoft's in charge of Blazor, and Meta is in charge of React. So we have all the big monopolies together, or not monopolies, we have the big players all creating these frameworks and all competing for each other and all that good stuff. So Angular being the oldest one of the bunch. So, what are we going to discuss about Angular today? Not performance yet. Wait. Okay. We got to get through some stuff first, because I know some of you out there may not have any .NET experience and don't have JS experience, so you're trying to learn, which is why you watched this video most likely. So we know that Blazor came out in 2018. Now, this is a Blazor versus Angular video, but I'll probably skim over some of the Blazor stuff because I went over a lot of it in my Blazor versus React video, but I will give you basically the rundown. So Blazor came out in 2018. It's the newest one of these three frameworks, and the separating thing between it and Angular and React is going to be that you can write your front end code in C#. So if you come from a .NET background, it'll be much easier for you to develop in Blazor. It's also much newer and it's still being developed. It doesn't have the maturity yet. It's getting there, but it's not as mature as Angular, obviously being created in 2011 or released in 2011, and React, I believe, was in 2013. I want to say. So. And if I'm wrong about that, check out my video, and I'll probably be right because I read all my notes at that time. But let's discuss a little bit about how things get done in Angular. So Angular, because it's the older one, it had to deal with the issue of HTML and the browser and the performance hits that you get when you try to manipulate the DOM directly. Now, that's what JavaScript does. JavaScript will interact with the actual DOM through code, like through its own language, but that is very slow and it's very bad, and you don't want to do that. So the solution Angular brought up was one of the first of the more innovative ways of dealing with it is by creating something that's virtualized on the DOM. Now, Angular is not fully virtual like React, and it's not or Blazor, because Blazor technically is fully virtual, but it has a different connotation to it. It's called the incremental DOM, which does something else. But Angular has something called a shadow DOM. So Angular, this specific one that you see, has basically whenever it tries to render something, it renders things in blocks, and those blocks of code on the browser, or not blocks of code, but those blocks of elements or whatever, that's actually virtual. So you have little snippets of virtualized space on your browser, but it's not fully virtualized like Blazor or React. With Blazor, on the other hand, you have it completely virtualized more or less, but it uses an extra step to it, basically called an incremental DOM, in order to save on performance. Basically that it's always checking for changes and then seeing if there is a change, then it will render something. If there isn't a change, it doesn't do anything. In a nutshell, there's more to it than that, but I'm not going to get into that right now. However, think of Angular as doing something similar, except in smaller chunks, depending on wherever you put the actual code for that, which I'll get into a little bit later, I guess. And now it's time that you've all been waiting for, all right? I know that you guys were waiting for this for a long time. I know you guys want the performance question. I'm going to tell it to you right here because you're such good boys and girls. I'll give you the performance question now, and then we'll go into the technical stuff a little bit later. So when it comes to performance, typically this comes in the form of two questions or two ways of dealing with it. The performance of Blazor versus the performance of Angular usually boils down to how fast I can get to a resource on the actual site and how fast it loads. So it depends. Between Angular and Blazor, I would assume I'll give the edge to Angular only because it doesn't have to do the whole loading thing that if you use Blazor WebAssembly, you have to deal with regardless. So that is one thing to look at. The other thing to look at is how fast is it when you actually go from place to place. Now, I would give Blazor and Angular about even Stevens on this one because Blazor and Angular both use virtualized they use virtualized code in the background, and they leverage a lot of stuff to make themselves more performant. And depending on how you build your project, like you can make a really crappy Angular project. Like it's real easy to do, just like you can make a real crappy Blazor project. So you increasing the performance to a degree where you can beat one or the other is really up to your own coding skills. But since they use the virtualization concept in their own ways, I may give the edge to Blazor after the loading piece, only because everything is virtualized on Blazor. That's how React works, and React is the faster of the three. And Blazor uses a version of that, essentially. It's all virtualized. And Angular has snippets of virtualization, which should induce a little bit of performances, but not enough to actually make any real difference. So it really is just a kind of a coin toss almost. So when it comes to actually navigating the page, there's no true difference there because after everything's loaded, then you can do whatever you want. Same with Angular. And the only problem is when Blazor WebAssembly takes into consideration the loading problem, which I don't believe it has fixed just yet. It's getting better, but it's that's what maturity gives you. Angular is way more mature. So when it comes to, I guess, overall performance, I will just give it to Angular simply because of so because it has basically 10 years over Blazor, more or less, of dealing with a lot of performance issues, and has been optimized to a very decent point. But performance is not everything with a web framework, especially if you're coming from a .NET space. You kind of don't care as much because you probably dealt with other garbage frameworks. Okay, not garbage frameworks, but you probably dealt with other frameworks that are slower, but they got the job done. And you're trying to convert to Blazor because it is faster and is much more compatible or competitive, should I say, to the other JavaScript frameworks. And the bonus being that you don't have to use JavaScript or you don't have to use TypeScript or whatever other language to do your front end, which is the reason why people move to Blazor. So I'm going to switch gears real quick and go do something else. Whoa, before I go though, I forgot to mention that if you want to discuss Blazor Server versus Angular, yes, the performance is similar, but with Blazor Server, you have to have an active connection to a signal using SignalR or whatever in order for you to keep that performance, because you're doing all the calls on the server side and then it uses SignalR to make things a little bit faster, blah, blah, blah. So basically, Angular does not have a need for all this since everything is front-loaded. The front-loading of Angular is faster because it's a smaller payload when it does that. But and Blazor has to, either Blazor Server has to have a connection to have the same performance at that point, or in Blazor WebAssembly, once it's finally loaded, it will have more or less the same performance because now you don't have any connections really, and everything's already loaded on the client side, and you're using WebAssembly and all that good stuff. So I just wanted to bring that up before I continue on. Well, now let's go over some technical stuff about Angular. So right here I have an Angular project ready to go. And I'm just going to go over some basic stuff on it. I'm not going to go too deep because Angular, it's deep. You know what I mean? There's a lot that goes into Angular, and I just didn't want to completely dive into it again because there is a lot to it. So Angular, unlike React, is actually a fully fledged web framework. Now, React you can consider it a library, but because I consider it as a marketplace functional equivalent to Angular or Blazor, I would put them, I will compare the two to see which one you want to learn. So Angular, on the other hand, is different from React in the sense that you actually have a full environment to play with. So everything is included, just like Blazor. All you have between the two, the similarities are that you don't need to go outside of either one of the starting package in order to create an application that's fully fledged and it has all the basic components you need and all the functionality that you're looking for. So as long as you understand how to put all that syntax together, you can create a full web application just by the starting project that you have. So how do we get this starting project? Number one, you need node.js. Number two, you need npm or ng. Let me see. You need to install npm, something called npm, whatever the newest version is. And then you have to install the Angular CLI so that you can create Angular components and stuff like that in the actual command line. I didn't do that. What I did is I just created the components as I would do it in Blazor, basically by doing it manually. But if you want to save yourself some time, you can do it through the command line. And what happens when you build after you build this project out, which is done by this syntax, ng new, whatever the name of your project is going to be, you can actually add components to it through the same ng commands. So I just do it manually, but if you do it through the ng commands, what it does is it will build out the three pieces of the three files that your components are made of, which is a CSS file, an HTML file, and a TypeScript file. So that's what that .ts is right here. It's TypeScript. So that's what Angular is. Angular uses TypeScript as its main coding language and has HTML. Like Blazor has C# and HTML. And it has CSS in the background, or whatever style sheet you want to use. You could use You could use other ones like SCSS or whatever, or SAS or whatever. But and I'm using Visual Studio Code, by the way, to do all this. However, I would just, before we get into more stuff, I'm going to go over one other thing. And you're downloading a Blazor server. The Blazor server is usually about 20 megabytes of code that you have to initially download. For Blazor WebAssembly, that's about 90 or 88 to 90 megabytes. If you want to include the identity server stuff, so you have identity server as a package within it, so you have all your authentication authorization needs ready to go, then that will boost that amount to about 100 to 110 megabytes more or less. But Angular comes with everything you need, um, except for the routing, strangely enough. But what happens is that when you do go and create a new Angular project, it's going to ask you if you want to add routing into it. I just said yes because I don't know why it asks separately for it, but I said yes. And it will also ask whether or not you want to send data to the Google team that's in charge of this, I guess. And I said no. So that's what's going to happen when you try to create Angular through Angular CLI. But now that I went over Blazor's, how big Blazor is, let's find out how big Angular is. So my Angular solution is within this folder. And if I go to the properties, I don't know if you can read that, but it says 482 megabytes. Now, I don't know how that happened, but it shouldn't be that much. It should be closer to 388, more or less, so 380, but it's a pretty hefty, big file to have here. So maybe it's because I did some changes in here, maybe because I've been running it differently. I don't know what's happening with this, why it is increased in size all of a sudden, but it is gonna be around 388 megabytes more or less for an Angular project. So look forward to having that much. It's modern days isn't horrible, but it is nearly half a gig, so that's a pretty big package to download. But yeah, so what you get with that is everything that's here. So I'm just gonna move this real quick. We're just gonna go over. I'm not gonna go over everything here. It's impossible. But this is all the packages you get from a common Angular startup project. So if you want to argue with me that this is the wrong way to do it, that there are more slimmer ways of doing it, I follow the thing that was on the Angular site. So I did and created an Angular project based on whatever the Angular official Angular site says to do. So that's what I'm gonna do, and it brings everything here, and not the form component stuff. I made that, and what it will bring is the app mod. Everything that has app in it was brought in with the project. So you have routing, you have a module here, a module, and then you have the actual components. So your components are made up of the HTML, TypeScript, and CSS files, and we have those same things for app.component here. And this is just a syntax that you can follow. You can follow this. It's not a syntax you have to follow, but I do this. If it's a component, say that it's a component so you don't get confused. And it might even be better to separate out all your the stuff that you need to separate out by component. So I would have this form component within like its own folder, this in its own folder. Like I would do something like that because this gets really crazy the more you have. This is just 2 components right now. So it just gets worse from there. But that's only because of my crappy organizing. You can organize it however you want. And then we have extra stuff. So we have an index.html. This is what actually is going to be on the project. So this app root you see, that is actually a component. So this component, I'm going to go over some technical stuff right now, by the way. This is actually a representation of this app component here because it has a name of app root. So the name, in this case for the component, is a selector. And now on the concept of it, so when we discuss components, it's basically HTML and code, right? But each Blazor and Angular have their own ways of doing it. In Blazor, you basically have something like this. You have the HTML piece here, and then you have a code piece, and then you have something, and then you have what you see here is like the name of a component that can be used within the HTML as well. So that is what's happening here. We have a component being used within the index.html. In this case, it is our app root, which is the first component that it brings in automatically. And what is part of the whole component, what's the skeleton of a component is basically, first you have to import the component, essentially library, if you want to think of it in .NET terms. But but there are different names for them. There's pipes, libraries, directives, etc., etc. There's a lot of them, but I'm not going to go over all that because this is going to get crazy. So I'm just going to go over the very slimmed down, narrow view of Angular so that we can get this ball rolling. So our components have a name that can be referred to across the system as long as you have this component available to you by importing it. So that also has a template associated with it. The template being the HTML site. So where we have in like where you could have we do a whole code behind things. You could separate code and HTML. In there, it's already separated for you if you want to do it that way. HTML and the code. So you have to refer to it within the from wherever it is in the source, um, whatever the file is called. And then you have your style URLs, which is the CSS part. So this is your CSS isolation if you want to do it that way. So in this case, what do we have? And then we have the actual logic that goes into it, which comes in the form of export class app component. And then this actually contains all the logic for the component. And just like in Blazor, it has life cycles as well. So you can access life cycle methods in order to do stuff like when you initialize a component, do something, blah, blah, blah. So it has its own ways of doing that. Just very similar to how Blazor does it. In fact, Blazor came afterwards, so I assume that Blazor copied it off these other frameworks who have similar ways of doing it. But that's good for us because that means there's much less confusion hopefully to go into, except when you actually dig into how Angular does everything. But I am going to be running this file. So I've done a few things already. I will go over them soon as to show you how to do very simple basic stuff that I'll be comparing to Blazor. But in this case, I've already shown you how to start a project, and I've shown you the skeleton of a component and how it treats the components across the system. So if I go to index.html again, you'll see this is our component here. So now that you've downloaded Node.js, you've downloaded npm, you download Angular CLI, you can now create your Angular stuff. And then you say yes to give Angular routing because for whatever reason it's separate, and then you say no to giving them data. And now we could actually begin testing stuff. So in order to run your Angular project, you have to use this command, ng-serve, and then it'll tell you the local host port that you need to use in order to access. It's not going to start up a browser for you automatically. You have to have a browser. So it's going to tell you right here to go to there. So that's exactly what we are going to do. Oh. So this is what comes with your Angular project. So nothing else is here in this case. I've added those files, but I don't want to show them just yet. This is everything, and the funny part is that all of this is essentially hard coded into the page. So if you don't believe me, these aren't actually like this is all the nice the CSS stuff that's happening here. It's all on the page directly. So if I go to here, as you can see, they put all the CSS directly on this page. It's not actually separated or anything. It's just within the style HTML blocks. And all the other HTML that's here is essentially just like hard-coded stuff from what I could tell. So what you're supposed to do with this is essentially it's going to show you a bunch of resources you could use, and then it'll ask you if you want to use this as your main page, you could delete this, blah blah blah. But essentially, everything here is kind of just on this page, and yeah. So all this are just a placeholder they decided to give you. So it's pretty cool. You get all this stuff here. This is one of the things I do like about Angular, at least when it comes to the starter project, that it gives you a lot of stuff already. Like Blazor's a little bit less likely. It doesn't have this stuff. When we start a Blazor project, you just see the 4 things and it give you like a basic concept or whatever. Here you actually have a lot of resources you can look into. But I don't care about any of that. We're gonna go into some more technical stuff in Angular. My bad. So I'm just going to keep it running. I don't really have much of a choice here. So I'm going to go over some concept with you real quick. So I already went over the components. See if I could find an example of Actually, no, I don't have to. I have it right here. So I went over already a component. This is directly from the Angular page. And I've shown you, my component. This is going to follow the same thing. You could actually hard code the HTML into the template if you want, but I don't think that's good practice. You could do it just for a quick, easy thing, but I would rather have everything, all or nothing kind of situation going on. But that is not the only thing you have with Angular. In fact, there's a lot of stuff with Angular you have to learn. A lot of stuff. But if I were to choose like the big three things I would want to learn first with Angular, apart from the actual how to import stuff, because it's a little bit different than Blazor, it isn't as straightforward. And I'll give you a hint here. If I go to the ng module, this is how we initially import all our modules. So stuff that we need in order to have access to like certain libraries, these are modules, or certain pieces of code across our program. And then just like in Blazor where you have importing different libraries and stuff, you will do the same thing in there when you want to do it. So you're doing something similar in the app. What is that module? I bet I will go to my form component instead to show you that I'm importing like directives, modules, pipes, like whatever. There's a bunch of these things that you have to keep in mind when you import them. So you could use whatever the code behind it is. So it can get, there's a lot to learn here. Not only that, but there's also directives, which is a different thing. So how would I describe? I think a directive is basically their version. I don't want to call it a component because it's not what it is. It's basically something that you can do in HTML. So like when we write our for loops within our HTML, we would do something like this or whatever. And then you would add like your piece of HTML in here. That they have different directives to do things like this. So in this case, if I wanted to do a for loop and loop through like a bunch of elements of HTML on top of in a component, I would have to do something similar to this. While in here, I have a specific directive that will essentially do the same thing called ngIf. So you will attach this to whatever the HTML is, in this case a div in this example, and that will do the if statement for you. And if you want to do the for, like I showed you in Blazor, there's a version of that too called ng4 that you have to follow this syntax in order to do the whole item stuff. So you have to learn that, and then on top of that, I think the other important thing is how to do something called an observable. So an observable is essentially, I'm just gonna go here because I'm not gonna buy. An observable is essentially a concept that allows Angular to do AJAX calls, so that you know when you have received data if you are expecting it. So the observable pattern is I will subscribe to a certain piece of data, and then now I'm in called the observer because I'm observing it, and then what am I observing? I'm just trying to observe whatever that piece of data is or whatever differences are for that piece of data, and that's because I have subscribed to it. So in order to do that in Angular, it looks kind of like this. So the reason why you want to do this is because this is how you're going to do your JS calls. Basically, it's how you're going to do your to import like JSON stuff. And to do something similar in Blazor, if you want to do something similar to that in Blazor, to do like a JSON call specifically to get this, it will be like that. So http.get from JSON async, and then you do stuff in the background. If you have to do a class, if you need a class or something to match whatever the data properties are, you would do something like that. But this is how this looks like here. So the way I would describe the observable pattern is very similar to how Blazor handles state, where you have services in here somewhere, and then if you have like a service that is related to some sort of state you want to keep track of, you have components that subscribe to that state, and then that is how it gets access to that information. And then when that state happens, you probably have an event handler somewhere in there that will change that's the data, and then your component's going to change it on the fly usually. So the observable pattern is very similar to that concept, but it is used to basically observe changes in data, specifically with an AJAX call is how usually that's used with Angular. So this might be all confusing because Angular is a beast to understand, and it's really, really annoying. It is one of the reasons why it ain't doing so hot compared to the other two, but I mean, it's older, has seniority, so it's all good. So I've already ran this. Let's go back here. So I've already shown you how to do, like, how this handles basically a JSON call. This is what you need. Now I'm going to show you how to do a form now because you've already seen that. Let's just go to it real quick. So actually, before we go to the form, let's go do routing real quick. So when you do routing, I'm sorry, I'm jumping around. It's just that there is a lot to go over here. So before I go to the form, I have to jump into the form to navigate to it. And how do I navigate to it? Well, in Angular, you have something called the app routing module. Here's where you will have your routes. So you'll put all your routes in a central routing file, the app routing module, and you'll have all your paths here. So my form, I gave it the name of new form component. That is the class that is the representative of that class. So what does that mean for me when it comes to here? I want to associate that component with a certain path name. So this path name is called form for me. So if I put /form, I should hit my form component. Now, the way this works is that this is the first hit is the one that it's going to choose. So if I put this on top of this, it's actually not going to ever reach form, even though I write /form. It's just going to redirect back to the home. So whenever you do write your routing, keep in mind that the order does matter. So you want to put like whatever, let's say like your error handling stuff, you want to put it all the way at the end somewhere, or your redirections you put after all the actual, the hard-coded paths you want to put on there. And to do this, you need the routing module, the routes, you need the ng module because that is the core module. So anything that says core here is basically something you absolutely will need on a page in order to do anything with, because these are all modules. See there? Well, actually, you can't see my finger. You see there it says module? See here it says module? This is an ng module. Another module. So then you do an import and an export here. So I import the routes and I export my route module. I don't want to go over this too much because this is already getting out of. There's really a lot to learn. If you want me to go in, you want to go in depth on this, I would suggest reading up on the Angular stuff because I'm not going to go in depth on this. I'm just going to tell you that for routes, you have a central routing place and you just follow this syntax in order to get your routes to work. So with that in mind, now the reason why that happened is because of the whole virtual the shadow DOM thing that I was talking about earlier. If I go to the index, not the index. If I go to the HTML, this is where my routing is going to lead to this router outlet. So if I want to actually like use this page to show you, the form in a whole new page or whatever, I'd have to set this up somewhere else. But I'm leaving it here because this is where the main project left it. So you're going to have to learn how to employ these components, especially when they virtualize things like this. So I did go here, and this is how you can tell that it is virtualized. I'm not actually navigating to a page. I'm rendering things, just like in Blazor. And I have my forms here. So this is a bit distracting. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to delete all this since I don't think I need this anymore. And the nice thing about Angular compared to Blazor is that when you do make changes and you save them, the changes are automatically applied, and then it kind of refreshes everything for you. So it's kind of like doing a hot reloading, where in Blazor's case, you have to actually press the hot reload button. So you see it's generating, it's successful. I go here and I'm at form. So there you go. That's a nice thing that Angular has over Blazor, is that it can do this real quick. So I have forms here. This is a proper form, and this is just something so I could demonstrate some data binding stuff with you. But I wanted to go into navigation first, and this is how navigation works. So You have to do this all on one page. So for you guys who are used to MVC, I think you have something called like map routing or something. So that's where you put your routes all in that one file in MVC. This is a similar concept to that. But in Blazor, you don't have to do any of that. In Blazor, I believe they do have that functionality. But what you really care about is just having your URIs up on each component, and then you can call them with either the navigation my nav menu, the nav with a component that has the like a navlink component. You could do it through an HTML component as well, or you could do it through the navigation manager, which is the code way of doing it. So you have options available to you, and you don't have to do a central routing page for all of it. You can just do something like this. And each one has their conventions of actually importing like properties and stuff. So if you want to add like numbers or whatever, or integers or strings or and stuff like that, they both do the same thing. They both have wildcards. They both have ways of doing that. But I'm not going to go into it because I think it's a bit redundant, and you understand that routes sometimes have numbers and stuff at the end to denote what to do with that route and to import data or pass in data into that link. So we got that. So that we got the routing stuff done. The next thing I'm going to show you is data binding. So in my form, my one component that I created, I have stuff up here to show you how data binding looks like. So in this case, there's data binding happening everywhere, kind of. But if I go into my form.ts, you'll see what's going on. So we're going to ignore the form real quick and we'll just focus on this username. So this is essentially basically me creating a local variable of a string with some placeholder in there. When I have this here, I can put this within the HTML as long as it is part of my component as this ng model thing here. And then it's going to look for username. So the way you can do, the way you show what the value is, or the way that you would show the actual code part within this template, is by having it in double curly braces and then the name of the local, then the name of the variable. So it's equivalent to us doing this essentially. As I have a message here, that would be the equivalent of doing that. But yeah, that's how they do that. And then this is how we do binding, at least in this case for the username. So if I went back to my file, I change placeholder to test, I'll have this. So for data binding in Blazor, it's very similar. You have to, let me see if I can find a good one here. I had these more or less ready to go. So I had one, like a really good one that had like a bunch of them, but that's fine. We could just use this. You have to do add bind value, and you could do it with events with like add on click, and then you add the event in here. So this is how you would do data binding within Blazor. So it's very, very similar to how you would do it with Angular, except for obviously the syntax is a little bit different. So there's really not much to it. Like it just needs access to whatever this is, and the same way with Angular. That you need access to whatever the module is. So it has that by doing this, by having this connection to it to this template URL. Then you have this ng module. So this is one of those ng things that I was talking about. That this is one of those syntax. This is basically a syntactual. Basically, it's like doing this. It's basically doing the two-way data binding. Is what I'm saying. Trying to say to you. In this case. For a form, however, it's a little bit different. Forms are a little bit different in Blazor as well. So I'm just going to over the form in Blazor because I think it's a lot easier. And I've done this already a few times. And I don't feel as lost. As you can tell, I'm not really an Angular developer. I know a little bit of Angular, but there's just a lot to it. So in this case, our forms have a model. Now, Angular has two kinds of forms, actually, reactive forms and I think dynamic forms. And one of the forms uses models and the other one does not. So I believe that is the difference. Correct me if I'm wrong, my Angular friends, because I am feeling out of my element here. But in this case, in order to create a form in Blazor, you have to follow the specific components if you want to add them into it, and then you can add HTML in it as well. But in order for you to actually pass this in as a submit or whatever, you have to have the model fulfilled. So my profile state in this case has only a first name and last name, and they have values bound to it. So it is expecting it. If I want to expect it, you could also have validations within it as well through the use of components of validation in Blazor. And that's basically how you create a form in here. Do it here. You have to create the form HTML and then have a form group or a form control. So form control is essentially if you have like one piece of information you want to put in a form, but that's kind of useless. So normally you want multiple pieces of information. This is how you would do that. So this will be the equivalent to building out a model for Blazor. So first name and last name have to be built out this way within a form group that then, as long as you have the form group component, imported in basically, or module, whatever. I get them confused a lot. This is really confusing. So profile form, new form group, I have first and last name here. And now I'll be representative here as first and last name. So it's gonna know already. And you submit another one of these things. This is how we get our form group in here. So we need the form control names to match whatever the name that we've used in the actual profile form object that we created. So it have to be first name and last name, and then we could add stuff to it. Now, in order to actually read this, whereas in Blazor, where's my form? In Blazor, if I wanted to read out the actual values, I could do a few things here. I could have a local value to represent it, or I could actually go to a class that is representative here itself and have that read out within either the input text component or outside of it if I feel like it, by having something again like this. In this case, last name. So whenever I change the last name here, it will change whatever this value is outside of it in the HTML somewhere. To do the same within Angular, you have to follow a little bit of the conventions of JavaScript, I believe. So I don't remember this type of JavaScript, sorry, but this is how you would do it. So this dot the profile form, which is the name of the form group that I've given it. Then I go into the controls. So I'm looking for this stuff here, the form control, and then I have to type out the name. Now we're not done yet because that name is an object. It's a JavaScript object basically. And then I have to find within the JavaScript object a value. So this is how I would do it with this syntax within the double curly braces. And then the result of that, as you can see up here, I actually have my forms bound, and then I could actually read all the values that change with that. So that's how you do a form within Angular. This is how you do one of the forms. In this case, I use a form group. I believe this is the simplest version of the form that it has. There's another form you can use, but I'm not going to go into that. I think this is a lot already. And we still got more to go. Yes, we do. We already did forms. We did navigation routing. We did data binding. Getting data in with a JSON call. Now, real briefly, I'm just going to go over the DTO. I know one of you asked for the DTO, so I decided, you know what, I'm gonna acknowledge it because I love my people, and you know what, I didn't have to do any work, thank God. So if you look up what a DTO is, essentially we want a data object. So how do we do that within Angular? Well, you will use the subscribe again. So I've described this before, the observable model, that we are looking for an object that's coming in and it's going to change or whatever. In this case, we're subscribing to some we're going to subscribe to essentially the data that's coming in, but that data will be representative within some class. In this case, they're using whatever base DTO class, and this is where you put all the properties of whatever you're expecting. So if you have like a table of like 5 values, you need to put the 5 values here, and then that is what will come back, and that's how you get the data. And then you use the subscribe, the observable template or whatever you want to call it, in order to actually grab the data and make sure your components actually have access to it and they understand that they have access to it, that they're awake to it or whatever. So that is how you would do it, just like how you would do a JSON call. And within Blazor, it's basically just the whole .NET entity framework convention of grabbing it from the database, having a class that represents whatever is coming in, and then I have an object of that class or whatever I want to do with it. So that is the equivalent of the two. Either way, this essentially both of them are expecting that you have a model of some sort coming out if you're going to do it that way. So what else do we have for Angular today? We went over a lot of stuff. Let's go over some less technical things like its popularity and how much money you can make as an Angular developer. Well, now for the fun part. Now that we went through all that technical stuff, there was a lot of it that I'm just giving you. That was just a taste of Angular. So in case you were wondering, was that it? No. If you want to get into Angular, there is a big beast waiting to be tackled, because my goodness, there is a lot that goes into it. I have not even gone into a lot of the more technical stuff. Like, I skimmed over some of the harder things just to get through like the forms and stuff. This is why this video took so long to do, because I had to wrap my head around it, and I did it once before years back, and I still had issues with it. Well, you probably guessed what my opinion with Angular is, but that's because I'm a .NET developer and I'm used to one other thing. Anyways, I'll put my bias slightly aside for a little bit. Now, what do we see here? We see a bunch of colors on a screen. What does this mean? This is the Google Trends here. So I put Blazor up here as well, but I keep forgetting that when people look up Blazor, sometimes they don't write Blazor. In fact, this doesn't even have like a Blazor WebAssembly or whatever up here. It just says, if I try to write that, it's just down here. So I'm not really sure what it's looking for. So I don't know. So instead I put .NET and C# because if you're gonna do Blazor, you're gonna encounter .NET stuff and C# stuff. You're probably looking for .NET, Blazor, C#, whatever. You know what I mean? So I put those three up here. And I have React and Angular. So these are the correct ones. Web Framework and the React JavaScript library. So these are solidly the correct ones. So the blue one is where Angular is at 24. So if so I'm just gonna get rid of the Blazor real quick. Maybe this will help I'll put them back. Put these back. Oof. Yeah, whatever. Leave C# there. So Angular is here at the bottom. It's been stable. It's not horrible. Like, people still use Angular. Angular is one of the older frameworks there is right now that is still being used for modern day development. React is probably at the highest right now, and C#, because C# is also old as hell, and C# is Blazor. If I try to look up Blazor anything, it's gonna be down here somewhere. So this is expected. It's Blazor's new, and it doesn't even have like the correct search term up here. Like C# at least, you got the actual correct stuff up here. But C# has also a lot of other places it goes to. So I kind of view them both as more or less the same. However, when it comes to Angular versus React, Angular loses to React. And part of the reason is because of how complex Angular is. So you have React that is far simpler to learn, in my opinion, than Angular. And also doesn't require you to understand so many things at once. The learning curve is freaking huge compared to React. React's learning curve is deceptive in its packaging because it doesn't have a package, essentially. Like, you have to find other packages to do your React stuff for you. But that is... So it kind of gives the illusion that it's easier. but in practice, it actually is easier. So I don't know. In this case, I haven't even gotten to like WebSockets or Webpacks or anything with not WebSockets, but when it comes to Webpacks and stuff like that, because I didn't want to get into it. I remember Webpacks. I don't want to deal with it. So that is so the biggest thing that I see Angular having, at least when it comes to between React and Blazor, is the learning curve. If you're coming from .NET, then you should be golden, more or less. But I'll get into that later. So this is the Angular jobs portion. So I didn't find too many. I found this one is pretty good, 80 to 115,000. Then the React job, and then other Angular jobs that did not report their salaries. So I had to go in a little bit deeper than going through Indeed. So I went to salary.com and found that they say that it's between 60 and 98,000. I think that is a little low, but we'll see what other players have to say. ZipRecruiter says 107,000, and Glassdoor says about 105,000. So I say that is closer to the average between low six figures up to maybe mid six figures, I will say. So in line with the other ones, and in line with React, in line with the .NET job if you want as well. Because unfortunately, Blazor is still pretty new. So there are jobs still kicking about. There are jobs that are being offered for Blazor stuff, but it's still gonna be more time before it starts to kick up more in the Google Trends here. So I don't hide this from you. I'm not gonna claim that Blazor is beating everybody. I'm just saying that here are what Google Trends says is the facts. And what it says is that Angular is below React because React is let's face it, is a little bit better at what Angular does, and especially at a lighter package, and the fact that the concepts when it comes to React are actually a lot more easier to grasp. So it took me less time to build the React project from that last video than it took this one, and this was the fully built project. Like, it took a long time to get these together and just to get them to work, and then to understand that I need to do this, this, and this, and go through it was a lot of problems. So if you are out there, because I know that at least a third of you in my audience are neither on .NET camp or neither in a .js camp, and you want to get started in programming, or you want to get started in a web framework that is easier. If I had to choose between the two, I would between like Angular or Blazor or React. If you have some JavaScript experience or TypeScript experience, then go for React over Angular. Not only because of the Google Trends here, but also because the learning curve is way easier. Like, yes, the problem with React is the fact that you have to learn how to select your packages and have them play together nicely. But that pales in comparison, in my opinion, to the fact that you have to learn this entire Angular ecosystem. So I have not even gone to Webpacks. And I don't want to get into it. I'll just leave it there. So, and this is just basic baby stuff in order for you to have like a very simple program or something simple to happen on your web framework. It's not robust yet. One thing I really do like about Angular at the very minimum is that unlike like Blazor has issues with CSS isolation, it just got CSS isolation. So CSS isolation existed from the get-go for Angular, from what I can tell, and unfortunately that's something gets Blazor, but I hope it will improve, because what you can kind of do with this, I guess, is you can refer to other CSS files. So if you want to have a component refer to more have one CSS file to be referred to multiple components, you can do that. So it's still in CSS isolation. It's just for multiple components. I don't believe you can do that in Blazor. It's either global or it's either in the CSS isolation block. And I have a video for that too if you want to watch it. So it's all good. And if you are in the .NET camp, so I like Blazor a lot because I don't have to move away from C#. I don't have to learn all that stuff. Imagine you having to have a .NET background and then someone telling you have to learn Angular, and then you're like, oh god, I have to learn Angular. Oops, I'll show that. No endorsements yet. I'm not getting endorsements, so that was an accident. But yeah, if you're coming from a .NET camp of some sort, I would consider learning Blazor. I think that the learning curve for Angular is very, very high, unless you already know Angular from before. It is still well supported. Google still supports it a lot, and it's never gonna let it go. Um, from what I can tell, I think there's like version what 14, 18 right now. I don't really know, but React is the same way. Meta is never gonna let React go either, and Blazor seems to be the future of Microsoft. Microsoft is moving into the direction of Blazor, especially with .NET 6 .NET 6 rollout. Now everything has to be within the .NET 6 framework, and Blazor is already in there, so it's not a migration headache, especially for those of you that are trying to migrate up to .NET 6. I get your pain, I feel you, and I don't like it either. But if we are looking for a new framework to learn, a web framework, then Blazor at least will not have the incompatibility issues, and you will still be able to use your .NET knowledge in here. Now, and I think it's just a lot easier to learn. Like, you can learn Blazor far faster than Angular if you're coming from a .NET space. If you have neither space to work with, then you have to ask yourself a question. Do you want to go through the trouble of learning Angular? Because you're basically going to be stuck with Angular and everything that goes with it. So it's kind of a weird. If I were to describe Angular, you are inheriting a full environment to learn with, and you can do everything in that environment. But apart from your own libraries and stuff, it does. You could do some TypeScript translations to React if you want to, but if you're gonna do that anyway, just to have that ability, I would just learn React at that point. React seems to have a more popular market, and although Angular is older, it does show its age. This massive package to just get started of 300 megabytes is crazy to me. And I know that Blazor, especially Blazor WebAssembly, is not a slim, but it at least is manageable. It's 100 megabytes, and you get the identity server stuff. Here, you have, I don't know where the identity stuff is for this. I forget how to do it, and I'm sure it's somewhere in here. I'm sure it's here. It has to be. If not, then this is a lot of stuff, and you're missing a lot of stuff. And yes, you could have an Angular front end with a .NET backend. I've tried that before because you wanted to avoid some of the other pitfalls that comes with using a JavaScript framework, and then you want to use the .NET backend because it's a lot more robust. Blah 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 blah. Whatever. I've done that before. You can't do it with Angular, but man, is the learning curve crazy to get that far. And then you have Blazor sitting here just being like, you have half the knowledge already to learn this. All you have to do is learn the conventions of this. You don't have to go out of your way to learn the directives. You don't have to learn how to use the imports, the ng modules, the what else we got here? Because apart from this, you also have to learn TypeScript as well. So TypeScript, you have to do basically how to use that within Angular. So you're learning a lot for this framework. And if you are coming from a .NET, background, I get why you would want to go into something with JS, because that's still kind of like the norm, is to have some JS front end with a .NET backend. But I would probably go for React at that point and learn that, because you will learn TypeScript with React anyways, or JS, or whatever you want. You could do either one with React. And you have like more freedom to do stuff. Like, there's so much that goes into, you have to put a lot of investment to learn Angular. Just like if you're going into .NET from scratch, there's a lot of investment to learn how to do .NET, C#, object-oriented programming, all that stuff. So it really depends on where you want to be at the end of the day. Do you want to keep in the Microsoft camp, or do you want to go into the JS camp of Angular and possibly be stuck with whatever Angular already has, essentially? With Microsoft.NET, I like it a little bit better, because not only can you go into other technologies, Microsoft also has its own cloud base. Microsoft has a lot of stuff going for it that you could do, cross technology things with it. Angular's a bit more on its lonesome when it comes to this, and it is fairly old, and it does show its age, although it is impressive from when it came out. Like, if you think about it in terms of being one of the first frameworks to go into using the virtualization model and all that stuff, it's pretty crazy. But it's 2022, and we gotta start making decisions on what's best for us as going to the future. React, as you can tell, is a pretty decent competitor to it. So back to the So React is a pretty decent competitor to it. And the main thing about Blazor is the fact that you don't have to go and learn JS anymore. You could just do C# off the bat and then just learn the Blazor conventions. And even though, yes, performance-wise, with Blazor WebAssembly specifically, it is a slower, I do think that the development speed that you can have with Blazor and the fact that it's still being optimized, it's still in its infancy more or less, compared to Angular, I think you're going to see some real results. Now, bonus here, to do mobile stuff, you have Ionic as a way of wrapping Angular into a near native application. So where Blazor has .NET MAUI to do that stuff. But I believe .NET MAUI is actually native, like basically as close to native as you're going to get using C# and Blazor and all that stuff. Whereas I'm not sure about Ionic, so I can't really say too much about Ionic. I never actually developed with it, so all I know is that Ionic is the equivalent of, let's say, React Native for Angular and .NET MAUI for Blazor. So that is what I will say to that. So anyways, this has been a very long video. Angular is a beast of a web framework. It's not a bad web framework, but you have to invest a lot of time, energy, and effort into it. If you want to go in, like that stuff I showed you, that is easy compared to what awaits you inside of the Angular path. If you want to go into .NET, I am .NET biased, obviously. This is just Blazor programming, so. But if you want to go to the JS, in the JS route, I would look into React before I go into Angular, in my opinion. I know there's some of you Angular guys out there. I'm not sure how many of you are there. I don't think there's that many. Or are there? I'm not sure. I don't remember. I look back in that pool. But yeah. I don't see myself going into Angular unless I absolutely have to. And I hopefully don't have to in the future. If I were to continue going on the Blazor path and being on that path, I think I'll be happy with that. I think Blazor has a good future. I think that is the future of Microsoft web frameworks. And Angular has stood the test of time, but it does show, it has suffered some damage. It has wear and tear. It is a byproduct of the time from before. And if you want to learn TypeScript or you want to do some JS stuff, I would just go into React anyway. It's much easier to learn React than it is to learn Angular. There's no question. But yeah. Anyways, thank you for watching. I know this was a very long video, but if you stay till the end, I would like to, congratulate you and wish you luck. Like, subscribe, do all that good stuff, and watch the next video. If you haven't watched my React one, you should watch that one if you want to learn more about React. Peace out, guys.